Another traveler, lost among trees and memories, has found their way here, tired of wars, of whispers, and the weight of masks. Sit with me by the fire. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of Gaara, the one some call Jinchūriki, of Shukaku, a child of wind and shadow, marked by promises the world forgot, yet he bore them like scars upon his soul, until even the crows fell silent to hear him pass. The elders say that when he first drew breath, the desert itself held its voice. No wind stirred the dunes that night. No grain of sand dared whisper against another. In that profound stillness, a child was born who would carry the weight of storms within his small chest, though he knew not yet what tempests dwelt there. His mother's love had been traded for power before he could taste her milk, before her fingers could trace the soft curve of his cheek. The village fathers spoke of necessity, of protection, of burdens that must be borne by the young and innocent. But love knows no politics, and a mother's heart beats with rhythms older than any creed. They named him for a demon, though he was no more than flesh and bone, and the terrible longing that lives in every abandoned heart. The sand that would become his companion, his sword, his gentle executioner, first touched his skin like a blessing misunderstood. Each grain held memory of storms weathered, of travelers lost, of prayers whispered into endless horizons. In the cradle where other children might have found comfort, he found only the shifting embrace of something vast and alien. The sand moved without wind, coiled around his tiny fists like a promise written in a language he did not yet speak. His first tears fell not upon cotton or silk, but into the endless patience of the desert floor. Perhaps it happened this way, in the depths of night, when even the stars seemed to lean closer to listen. The child learned that solitude has its own weight. It settles upon the shoulders, like a cloak sewn from shadows, warm in its constancy, cold in its completeness. He learned to find music in silence, stories in the pattern of sand against his window, lullabies in the distant howl of wind across empty places. The village watched him grow, with eyes that held more fear than wonder. They saw the sand that followed him like a faithful dog, the way plants withered when he passed too close, the strange stillness that gathered around him like prayer. They did not see the child who traced letters in the dust, who whispered to the lizards that sunned themselves on hot stones, who dreamed of playmates made of cloud and starlight. Some still remember those early years as a time when questions hung in the air like incense. What manner of love could bloom in such barren soil? What tenderness might unfold in a heart wrapped so tightly in protection that it had forgotten how to beat without caution? The answers, they say, were written in sand that shifted too quickly for ordinary eyes to read. His father's love was a distant thing, measured in glances that lasted heartbeats, in words carefully chosen for their emptiness. Safety, they called it. Necessity. The child learned that love could be a luxury, too dangerous for those who carried storms in their blood. He learned to hunger for what he had never tasted, to grieve for what had never been offered. In the silence of the woods, where even memory grows moss and bark, they say his true education began, not in the study of scrolls or the practice of forms, but in the deep curriculum of isolation. Sand became his teacher, solitude his mentor, and the vast indifference of the desert his first and most honest friend. Perhaps it happened this way. One morning, the child woke to find that sleep had become a stranger to him, not by choice, but by the restless stirring of something vast and ancient that shared his small bed, his smaller heart. The beast within, for that is what they called it, though beasts love their young, and this thing knew only hunger, had learned to speak in the voice of sandstorms. The elders say that insomnia is the tax levied on those who house infinity in finite flesh. Night after night, he would sit by his window and watch the world sleep, watch families gather around tables he would never know, watch other children chase fireflies through gardens where his feet would never be welcome. The sand around him moved in restless patterns, spelling words in languages that predated human sorrow. They brought him tutors who taught him the arts of governance, the weight of decisions that would shape 1,000 tomorrows. But what use are lessons in leadership to a child who cannot trust his own shadow? What meaning does responsibility hold for one whose every breath might birth a catastrophe? He learned statecraft with the same mechanical precision with which he learned to contain the tempest in his chest, necessary skills for a soul that belonged more to duty than to itself. In the marketplace, mothers would pull their children closer when he passed, not from cruelty, but from an instinct older than kindness. They sensed the storm that walked among them, disguised as a boy with sand in his hair and questions in his eyes that had no safe answers. He learned to read fear like a second language, to navigate the careful architecture of avoidance that people built around him. Some still remember the first time they saw him practice what others called his art, sand rising like prayers, made visible, dancing in configurations that spoke of power too great for such small hands to hold. But those who watched more carefully saw something else, a lonely child trying to make friends from the only material that would not flee his touch. Each sculpture of sand was a playmate that could not abandon him, a companion that understood the particular weight of being unwanted. The Desert Fathers taught him meditation, though they did not call it that. They called it survival. Sit with the storm, they said. Learn its moods, its hungers, its dreams of devastation. Become the eye of your own hurricane, the still point around which chaos might dance without consuming everything in its path. He learned to find silence within noise, peace within the endless conversation of wind and sand. But peace, the elders say, is not the same as happiness. Peace is the deep stillness of snow-covered graves, the profound quiet of libraries where no one comes to read. Happiness is a bird that will not nest in cages, no matter how gilded, no matter how necessary those bars might be for the safety of the world beyond. His dreams, when exhaustion finally claimed him, were vast and terrible. He walked through landscapes made of grinding sand, where voices called to him from every grain, the voices of those who had fallen to storms like the one he carried. They whispered of destruction as a form of love, of chaos as the truest expression of freedom. He woke with their words in his mouth, like grit between his teeth, in the silence of the woods, where memory settles like sediment in still pools. They say he learned the first great lesson of those who are born to power they did not seek, that strength without love is a blade that cuts its wielder, that protection without affection is a wall that imprisons the guardian as surely as it shields the guarded. The sand around him grew denser, more responsive, more protective, a cocoon of earth that promised safety at the price of touch. He was becoming something other than human, not by choice, but by the slow alchemy of isolation. Each day added another layer to the armor that kept the world safe from him, and him safe from the world's judgment. The elders say that every ruler must learn the choreography of faces, which expression to wear when signing treaties, which smile to offer when accepting the burdens that come wrapped in ceremony and expectation. But for one who carried tempests in his chest, the dance was more complex, the steps more treacherous than any court intrigue. Perhaps it happened this way. Standing before mirrors made of polished metal, he practiced the careful architecture of normalcy, a slight softening around the eyes to suggest kindness, a measured nod that implied wisdom, without revealing the profound uncertainty that lived beneath his careful composure. The sand around him would still its restless movement when others were watching, playing its part in the elaborate theater of acceptance. They dressed him in robes that spoke of authority, draped him in symbols that transformed the strange boy into something the village could understand: a leader, a protector, a vessel for their hopes rather than their fears. But cloth cannot contain storms, and ceremony cannot baptize away the loneliness that had grown into his bones, like salt into old wood. In council meetings, he learned to speak in the careful language of compromise and consideration. His voice, when it emerged, carried the strange resonance of wind through hollowed stone. The advisors listened with the careful attention due to one whose displeasure might reshape the landscape, but they did not hear the questions that lived beneath his measured words. Am I enough? Can I be trusted? What manner of love might exist for one who has never known its touch? The village children had grown into young adults who spoke to him now with the formal distance of subjects addressing their sovereign. They called him by titles that tasted like ash in his mouth. Your Excellence, Lord Gaara, Guardian of Sands. He would have traded all these honorifics for a single friend who might speak his name without ceremony, who might sit with him in comfortable silence and require nothing but presence. Some still remember the day he first walked among his people, not as their burden, but as their protector. Sand rose around him like a benevolent storm, shielding workers from falling stones, guiding lost children home through dust that sparkled with an intelligence beyond weather. For the first time, the power that had isolated him became a bridge. The storms he carried transformed from threat into shelter. But protection, the elders say, is not the same as belonging. He could keep them safe, could stand between them and every danger that wore flesh or breathed fire, but he could not join them at their tables, could not share their laughter without the careful distance that reminded everyone present that he was other, that his presence came with conditions and consideration. In the silence of the woods, where intention grows moss and purpose puts down roots, they say he discovered the peculiar mathematics of leadership. One person's safety multiplied by 1,000 individual needs, divided by the loneliness of making decisions that touched every life but his own. The weight of so many hopes had its own gravity, pulling him further from the simple human wants that still lived in the secret chambers of his heart. He learned to find comfort in duty, because duty, unlike love, made no demands upon the heart. Duty was clear in its expectations, honest in its limitations. Love was the dangerous country he had glimpsed but never entered, the song he had heard but never learned to sing. Duty was the steady rhythm that kept him walking forward when every step felt like exile from a home he had never known. The sand around him had evolved into something almost sentient, reading his moods before he himself understood them, responding to threats he had not yet perceived. It moved like liquid protection, like earth dreaming it was water, like the embrace he had never received, given form and weight and unquestioning loyalty. In its constant presence, he found the closest thing to companionship his circumstances would allow. At night, when the village slept, and he maintained his vigilant wakefulness, he would sometimes allow the mask to slip. In the privacy of his chambers, surrounded by sand that judged nothing and demanded nothing, he would remember the child who had once built castles from dust and called them kingdoms, where loneliness was not the price of power, where storms could be gentle and protection could be offered without the terrible distance of necessity. Perhaps it happened this way. There came a season when travelers brought stories from beyond the desert's edge, tales of children who fought with fists full of lightning and hearts full of the particular courage that belongs to those who have never been taught to fear their own strength. In their stories, he heard echoes of a music he had almost forgotten, the sound of belonging. The elders say that understanding comes to some like sudden rain to parched earth, flooding the landscape of certainty until everything familiar becomes foreign, and everything foreign reveals itself as long-lost truth. For him, understanding arrived in fragments, in glimpses, caught between the shifting patterns of sand, in moments when the storm in his chest quieted enough for him to hear the smaller, steadier rhythm of his own human heart. In council sessions, he began to listen not just to the words his advisors spoke, but to the silences between them, the careful pauses that revealed their fear, the quick glances they exchanged when they thought he was not watching. He began to understand that the distance he had mistaken for respect was something else entirely, something that had roots in the soil of his own loneliness and bloomed into the strange flower of mutual isolation. They brought him reports of other villages, other young people who carried burdens similar to his own. He learned that he was not the only child to be born into circumstances too large for human hearts to hold, not the only one to wear power like an ill-fitting coat that promised warmth but delivered only the weight of expectation. In this knowledge, he found something that resembled companionship, the solidarity of the uniquely burdened. Some still remember the day he first spoke, not as a leader issuing commands, but as a young man offering something harder to give than orders, understanding. His voice, when it carried this new quality, seemed to part the air differently, to settle into silences that had been waiting generations for the right words to fill them. The sand around him began to move with different intentions. Where once it had formed barriers and weapons, now it created small beauties, delicate sculptures that bloomed and dissolved like thoughts made visible, patterns that spoke of wonder rather than warning. The children who had once fled his presence began to pause at safe distances, mesmerized by these ephemeral artworks that asked nothing of them but momentary attention. In the silence of the woods, where compassion puts down roots deep enough to anchor mountains, they say he discovered the alchemy by which solitude could be transformed into solace, not for himself, but for others who carried their own storms, their own careful architectures of protection and distance. He learned that understanding could be offered like water to the thirsty, asking nothing in return but the simple acknowledgement that thirst existed. The letters that arrived from distant places spoke of alliances, of treaties, and trade agreements, but beneath the formal language of diplomacy, he began to read other messages, invitations to step beyond the borders of his own isolation, opportunities to discover what manner of person he might become if given the chance to exist in relation to others, rather than in careful separation from them. His dreams, when exhaustion finally offered them, had begun to change. The vast landscapes of grinding sand were still there, but now they included oases, small pools of clear water, where he could see his reflection without the distortion of storm and movement. In these dreams, he would sometimes hear laughter that did not mock, voices that spoke his name without ceremony or fear. The beast within, for it was still there, still hungering, still capable of devastation, had learned a different kind of patience. It had discovered that strength could be measured not in destruction unleashed, but in destruction carefully contained, channeled, transformed into something that served life rather than consuming it. This was perhaps the beginning of what others might call wisdom, though he knew it only as the slow recognition that power held meaning only in its relationship to what it chose to protect. He began to leave his chambers, not just for ceremonies and councils, but for the simple human act of walking among his people. The sand still accompanied him, still whispered its constant readiness to defend and destroy, but it moved now with something that resembled curiosity rather than mere vigilance, as if it too were learning new ways to exist in a world that contained more than threats and necessities. The elders say that trust is a country with no maps, a territory that must be explored without compass or guide, where every step forward requires a faith that the ground will hold. For one who had learned to walk carefully through a world that flinched at his approach, the prospect of such unmapped territory was both terrifying and irresistible. Perhaps it happened this way. There came visitors who did not arrange their faces into the careful neutrality he had come to expect from those who knew what he carried. They looked at him with the direct curiosity of those who were accustomed to dangerous things, who had learned to measure threat not by reputation, but by present intention. In their steady gaze, he found the first mirror that reflected not a vessel for contained catastrophe, but simply another young person carrying burdens too heavy for any single pair of shoulders. The sand around him responded to their presence differently than it had to any others. It did not rise in defensive walls or whisper warnings of potential betrayal. Instead, it settled into patterns that spoke of watchfulness without hostility, protection offered not from fear, but from something that resembled care. He began to understand that the difference lay not in the visitors themselves, but in his own willingness to imagine that trust might be possible. They spoke to him of their own villages, their own struggles with power that demanded isolation as the price of control. In their stories, he heard variations on themes he knew by heart: the careful distance that safety required, the weight of decisions that touched every life except the one making them, the particular loneliness of being needed for what you could do rather than wanted for who you were. Some still remember the first time they saw him laugh, not the careful smile that duty required in public ceremonies, but the unguarded sound that escapes when surprise catches the heart before the mind can intervene. It changed the very texture of the air around him, made the sand dance in spirals that spoke of joy rather than mere movement. For a moment, the boy he might have been in different circumstances flickered visible like starlight through storm clouds in the silence of the woods, where friendship puts down roots that grow stronger with time rather than weaker. They say he discovered that trust was not a single act of faith, but a daily practice, a muscle that strengthened with use. Each small revelation shared, each moment of vulnerability risked and met with understanding rather than exploitation, added another thread to the bridge that could span the distance between solitude and connection. The council meetings took on a different character when these new allies joined the discussions. Questions were asked, not just about strategy and resources, but about the human cost of decisions, about ways to protect that did not require the protector to sacrifice every hope of personal happiness. For the first time, he heard his advisors speak of his well-being as something valuable in itself, not merely as a means to ensure the village's security. His dreams had become landscapes where he was not always alone. Sometimes he walked with companions who did not flinch when the sand rose around him, who understood that his power was not a threat to be endured, but a gift to be appreciated in its proper context. In these dreams, he could almost remember what it felt like to be wanted rather than merely needed, valued rather than simply feared. The beast within had grown quieter, not from weakness, but from a different kind of strength. It had learned that it could be fierce in protection without being violent in isolation, that its power could serve connection rather than enforcing separation. This transformation was not a betrayal of its nature, but an evolution toward a more complete understanding of what protection might mean. Letters began to arrive, addressed not to his titles, but to his name, written in hands that had learned to shape words with affection rather than mere formality. He would read them in the quiet hours when the village slept, tracing the letters with fingers that had forgotten they could be gentle, that they could touch things without the constant awareness that they might also destroy. The sand had begun to create new patterns, not the defensive structures that had defined his earlier years, but formations that seemed to invite approach rather than warn away. Gardens of crystalline beauty that caught light and held it, sculptures that told stories of transformation rather than protection, artworks that spoke of a soul learning to imagine that it might be loved not despite its strangeness, but because of the unique gifts that strangeness might offer to a world brave enough to receive them. Perhaps it happened this way. There came a morning when he woke not to the familiar weight of vigilance, but to something lighter, more complex, the recognition that peace was not the absence of storm, but the presence of purpose aligned with possibility. The sand around him moved differently now, less like a guardian, constantly anticipating attack, and more like a partner in the daily dance of existence. The elders say that peace is a structure that must be built daily, brick by careful brick, with materials quarried from understanding and mortared with the gradual accumulation of small trusts. For one who had spent his early years believing that safety required separation, learning to build bridges rather than walls demanded nothing less than the complete reimagining of what protection might mean. In the council chambers, his voice had found new registers, tones that carried not just authority, but warmth, questions that arose not from suspicion, but from genuine curiosity about the lives of those he served. The advisors who had once measured their words with surgical precision now offered opinions that carried the easy honesty of those who had learned they would be heard rather than simply obeyed. The village itself had begun to change in response to this transformation. Children who had once given him the wide berth that fear demands now approached with the careful boldness of the young who sensed that wonder might be safer than they had been taught to believe. They watched the sand sculptures he created with eyes that held more fascination than apprehension, as if they were beginning to understand that strange did not necessarily mean dangerous. Some still remember the day he first joined the harvest festival, not as the ceremonial protector, observing from careful distance, but as a participant whose presence added to the celebration rather than constraining it. The sand danced with the music, creating temporary artworks that bloomed and dissolved in rhythm with the drums, as if it too had learned the difference between display and participation. His correspondence had grown to include letters that spoke not of treaties and trade agreements, but of the smaller, more precious exchanges between those who had discovered they could trust each other with their uncertainties as well as their strengths. He wrote of the strange education he was receiving in the daily practice of friendship, the way relationships could deepen not through grand gestures, but through the accumulated weight of small kindnesses offered and received. In the silence of the woods, where contentment puts down roots that need no tending beyond the simple acknowledgement of their presence, they say he learned that peace was not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a place to arrive, but a manner of being present wherever the journey happened to lead. The constant vigilance that had once exhausted him transformed into a gentler kind of awareness, a readiness to protect that came from love rather than duty. The beast within had not disappeared. The stories that claim such perfect transformations misunderstand the nature of integration. Rather, it had become part of a larger symphony, its power no longer a solitary note of potential destruction, but a harmony that enriched without overwhelming the music of ordinary life. He had learned to be not less than what he was, but more than what his fears had allowed him to imagine he could become. The sand responded to his emotions now with the sensitivity of a longtime companion who could read mood in the smallest shift of posture, the slightest change in breathing. When he was content, it would create small flourishes of beauty, spirals that caught sunlight, patterns that seemed to pulse with quiet joy. When he grieved for the years lost to isolation, it would settle into formations that spoke of comfort offered without question or condition. His sleep, when it came, brought dreams that were rich with possibility rather than haunted by regret. He walked through landscapes where the storm and the calm had learned to coexist, where power served love instead of enforcing its absence, where protection meant creating space for others to flourish rather than building walls to keep them safe but separate. The village children had begun to seek him out, not for the spectacle of his abilities, but for the stories he told, tales of other young people who carried unusual gifts, narratives that transformed strangeness from curse into calling. In their eager faces, he saw reflected not the monster he had once feared he might be, but the teacher he was surprised to discover he could become. The elders say that some lives are lived twice, once in the flesh and bone of daily existence, and again in the stories that outlive the teller, in the changes that ripple outward long after the stone that caused them has settled into the depths. For one who had spent his early years believing he would be remembered only as a cautionary tale, the discovery that he might leave behind something more beautiful than warning was a gift he had never thought to desire. Perhaps it happened this way. He began to notice that the young people who sought his counsel carried themselves differently when they left his presence, straighter, more certain, as if they had been reminded of possibilities they had forgotten they possessed. In their transformed bearing, he glimpsed the mathematics by which healing multiplied, the way one person's movement toward wholeness could become permission for others to risk their own journey out of whatever isolation they had learned to call safety. The letters that arrived spoke not just of political alliances, but of personal transformations. Leaders who had read his words or heard reports of his evolution wrote of their own experiments with trust, their tentative steps away from the fortress-like solitude that power often demanded. In their accounts, he began to understand that his story had become part of a larger narrative, proof that change was possible even for those who had been told their nature was fixed and unchangeable. The sand around him had developed what could only be called personality, quirks, and preferences that spoke of consciousness rather than mere responsiveness. It would create small gifts for visitors, delicate sculptures that captured something essential about each person's spirit. For the children, it made animals that moved with lifelike grace. For the elders, it formed patterns that honored the wisdom of years. For his friends, it created beauties too personal to translate, but too meaningful to dismiss as mere earth, responding to unconscious will. Some still remember the speech he gave at the dedication of the new memorial, not a monument to past conflicts, but a garden that celebrated the possibility of peace. His words that day carried the authority of experience rather than mere hope, the weight of transformation actually accomplished rather than simply desired. He spoke of storms that could become gardens, of isolation that could be alchemized into the deep solitude that made genuine connection possible. In the silence of the woods, where legacy puts down roots that will outlive the forest itself, they say he understood finally that his true gift to the world would not be the protection he could offer during his lifetime, but the example he provided of what was possible when someone born to carry destruction chose instead to cultivate creation. The young people who would face their own storms would carry with them the knowledge that transformation was possible, that no one was condemned to remain what their circumstances had initially made them. His teaching had evolved beyond formal instruction into something more like presence, the way his very existence contradicted the stories told about what happened to children born into impossible circumstances. Students came not just to learn techniques, but to witness living proof that healing was possible, that the most profound wounds could become sources of wisdom rather than perpetual sites of pain. The village itself had become a different place, shaped by the decades of his protection, but transformed by the years of his gradual opening. It drew visitors who came seeking not military alliance, but the rarer gift of hope made manifest. They returned to their own communities, carrying stories of a place where strangeness was not feared, but celebrated, where power served love rather than demanding its absence. His dreams had become collaborations between memory and imagination, visions of futures where the lessons learned through his particular form of suffering could spare others the years of isolation he had endured. In these dreams, he saw children who would be taught from the beginning that their strangeness was a gift waiting to be unwrapped, that protection could be offered from love rather than duty, that belonging was not something to be earned, but something to be claimed. The beast within had become something unprecedented, not tamed, for that would imply subjugation, but integrated, its fierce energy now part of a larger ecosystem of feeling and purpose. It had learned to be tender without being weak, powerful without being destructive, protective without being possessive. In this integration, he had discovered what the ancient texts meant when they spoke of strength perfected in gentleness, of the warrior who fought for life rather than against it. The elders say that all stories, no matter how long or complex, eventually find their way home, not to the place where they began, but to the truth that was hidden in their beginning, waiting to be discovered by the long path of experience. For one who had been born from the marriage of human need and elemental power, the end of the story could only be a return to the elements themselves, a dissolution that was not death, but completion. Perhaps it happened this way. There came a season when his step grew lighter, as if the earth itself were gently releasing its claim on him. Those who watched carefully noticed that the sand around him moved with increasing independence, creating patterns of beauty that seemed to arise from its own will, rather than his conscious direction. He was becoming less dense, more translucent, as if the boundaries that had once held his human form together were slowly, peacefully dissolving. In his final letters, written in a hand that grew more elegant as it grew less corporeal, he spoke of a contentment that had roots deeper than happiness, a satisfaction that came not from having achieved everything he had hoped for, but from having become more than he had ever believed possible. His words carried the weight of completion rather than ending, of transformation reaching its natural culmination rather than stopping mid-process. The children who had grown up under his protection, now adults with children of their own, would sometimes find small sculptures of sand in places where he had sat quietly, watching the sunset, or listening to their laughter, or simply resting in the particular peace that comes to those who have learned to belong to themselves completely enough to belong meaningfully to others. Some still remember the last time they saw him walking the borders of the village, his form already more suggestion than a substance, the sand around him moving in spirals that seemed to lift toward the sky rather than settle toward the earth. His footprints left patterns that looked like text written in a language older than human sorrow, messages that spoke of gratitude too deep for ordinary words to carry. In the silence of the woods, where eternity puts down roots that grow backward as well as forward, they say he spoke his final teaching not in words, but in the manner of his leaving, gently, without fanfare, like winter giving way to spring or day accepting the embrace of evening. Those who witnessed this transformation reported feeling not grief, but a strange comfort, as if they were being allowed to observe the natural order completing one of its most sacred cycle. The sand that had been his constant companion, his protector and partner, did not scatter randomly when his human form finally dissolved. Instead, it arranged itself into patterns that persisted long after any wind should have disturbed them, spirals that spoke of movement without destination, circles that suggested completion rather than containment, formations that honored the memory of conscious intention even as they celebrated the return to elemental simplicity. His absence was felt not as emptiness, but as presence distributed differently, no longer concentrated in human form, but spread throughout the very air and earth of the place he had protected and been changed by. The children reported dreams in which the wind itself taught them lessons about courage, in which the sand under their feet whispered stories of transformation and hope. The letters that continued to arrive from distant places spoke of similar phenomena, moments when travelers would feel an unexpected sense of safety in desert places, when storms would part around caravans as if guided by benevolent intelligence, when the very landscape seemed to remember what protection offered from love rather than duty felt like, and chose to continue that protection even in the absence of its original guardian. His story had become part of the larger story the wind tells as it moves through the world, carrying messages between the human and the elemental, the temporary and the eternal. Those who learned to listen could sometimes hear, in the sound of sand moving across stone, the echo of a voice that had learned to speak love in languages that had no words, protection in forms that required no force. And if someday, walking alone along a forgotten trail, you hear the sound of leaves weeping, perhaps he is still there, guarding the sorrows no one dared to remember.